All right, here we are. Chapter 2, Module 2. And here we're going to talk about two related phenomena. We're going to talk about, broadly, the creation of the United States of America. And then as part of that, we're going to talk about two interlinked things. Number one, the American Revolution, right, where we gain our independence from Great Britain. Spoiler alert, we do. We win that American Revolution. And then related to that, right, the creation of the United States Constitution in terms of creating the rules of the game for how we would govern ourselves once we gained that independence. So this first set of slides is going to be about the road to revolution. Okay, so what are the precursors to revolution? I have 5 of them here on that list. The first one. Well, first, I guess I should mention briefly that this was the age of colonialism. All right. This was an age in which a handful of European superpowers at that moment in time, this would have been going back probably to the as early as the 16th century, a handful of European superpowers dominated the globe. And at the peak of their power, they controlled about 3/4 of the land in the world. All right. And as they became increasingly powerful, they started to look for resources outside of their home countries across the globe, whether that was on the African continent or on the North American continent or South America or Asia. All right, they were hungry for resources around the globe to fuel their rise as superpowers. Right, and so hence the age of colonialism. So Great Britain, right, became the overlord of the American colonies on the eastern edge of the North American continent, 13 American colonies. The nature of that colonial relationship, right, is you got the mother country, right, the superpower, in this case Great Britain, and you've got the kids, in this case the 13 American colonies, right, and that's the nature of the colonial relationship. It's a hierarchical relationship between a parent and a young child. All right, so that's the basic setup here. And I think Britain came over and began to establish their colonies over here as early as, I think, 1607. All right, and now we're in the year 1764. So it's been about 160 years of a colony in North America. So, beginning in about 1764, Great Britain begins to impose taxes on the American colonies, right, to pay for things like the French and Indian War, which Great Britain had funded and executed to protect Americans on the western frontier, right, because Americans were starting to move inland and grow west, and they were coming up against French colonies, and they were coming up against Native American tribes that were hostile and militarily fairly powerful. Right, so the French and Indian Wars were efforts by the British to protect their 13 American colonies on the East Coast as they grew west. That's expensive, right? Because Britain's coming all the way across the ocean and then all the way across the landmass to get from the East Coast to, I guess, what would now be like Western Pennsylvania or Eastern Ohio. That's expensive. So Britain's view was, we're the mother country, you're the colonies, we're doing this for you, you need to help pay for it through taxes. We didn't like that. We didn't like that. But Britain's view would be, that's the nature of the colonial relationship. All right. Related to that, right, not only was Britain imposing tax policies on the Americans, they were also imposing measures to make it clear that Great Britain was the mom and the American colonies were the kids. Right, as our book points out, things like the Currency Act and the Quartering Act, right, that made it clear, look, we are not co-equal partners. This is not 50-50. It's more like 80-20 or 90-10. All right, and again, right, we increasingly resented that. It's almost like we were becoming young adults as colonies, right? Because we've been around since the early 1600s. We were starting to feel, right, like we were ready to be independent, like we're ready to stand on our own 2 feet. And Britain's like, oh, hell no, you're staying home. Mercantilism. Now, that's easy to miss. I don't think our book fully captures it. Mercantilism was a set of trade policies by Great Britain imposed on the colonies that said, hey, we're using you as a way to gather natural resources for the mother country. Right, so we're going to restrict what economic activities you can engage in. You can engage in the gathering of natural resources like growing cotton, fishing in the Atlantic Ocean, harvesting timber, trapping beaver for pelts and clothing and so forth. You can harvest all these natural resources. You're rich in them. We're not back in Great Britain. We're highly developed. You're not. You can harvest these natural resources and you can sell them to us and only us. Mercantilism. You can only sell them to us. And you cannot engage in any significant production of finished goods from those materials back in America. On no scale at all can you do that, because that would make you competition for us. We'll turn the cotton into clothing. We'll turn the lumber into furniture and ships. We'll turn the beaver pelts into fur hats and coats and so forth. Yeah. But and then we'll sell those finished goods back to you and across the globe and to our own people. Mercantilism. Okay. And America increasingly didn't like that deal, right? Because we're like, no, we can harvest natural resources, but we can also turn them into finished goods. We can do that. We're adults now. We can turn cotton into clothing, lumber into furniture. Beaver pelts into fur hats and coats and so forth. We can do that, and then we can sell it to you for the big markup. Right, so that's what made Americans frustrated. And I would say there were 2 groups in particular that were frustrated by that. It would have been the New England merchants, right, with their merchant ships. Now look, they were making good bank transporting natural resources from America to Britain, right, and then selling those natural resources in London to the Brits. They made good money doing that. But they knew, right, that they could make better money if they could use their merchant ships to transport finished goods across the globe and sell them in London, in Paris, in Barcelona, and across the globe. Right, they can make a lot more money that way. All right, there was money on the table, and it was being left on the table because of Britain's mercantilist policies. So the New England merchants, a powerful and elite economic group, were especially angry. Another group that was angry, the owners of plantations in the South growing cotton and lots of other crops like tobacco. Right? They also felt that if we could turn our cotton into clothing and our tobacco into things like pipe tobacco and chewing tobacco, if we could do all that here in America, and we could sell that in London, we could sell that in Paris, we could sell that in Barcelona, we could sell it to our own people as a finished good and get the big markup and the big profits. We're doing well growing and selling cotton, but we could do way better, right? So those 2 groups in particular, the economic elite in America, were especially incentivized to want independence, to escape Britain's mercantilist policies. 4th, you were getting a generational loosening of ties to the motherland, right? Remember, the British first began to come over in 1607, and by 1776, right, a lot of Americans were native-born Americans, right? Their connections to the mother country were getting loose. It's like today, right? When immigrants first come to America, right? Initially, that first wave of immigrants are sort of bifurcated in their loyalties, the country that they came from, the country that they're in. But by the second generation, right, much more devotion to American identity. And by the third generation, forget about it, right? Limited connection to the mother country that your grandparents came over from, and a strong sense of identity with the country in which you were born. That's happening here in America. More and more native-born Americans who no longer feel those emotional ties to the mother country. And then finally, ideas in the air, right? We talked about this, the ideas of John Locke, right? That we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And if government's not taking care of that, we have the right to rebellion. Rebellion, right? That's a revolutionary idea. Thomas Paine, right? The pamphleteer in America that published and distributed a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he argued that rule by a king is against common sense. Rule by a monarchy is against common sense. The only kind of governance that makes sense is democratic self-governance by we the people. Right? So there were ideas in the air that were sort of helping to set the stage for violent revolution. All right, so we've talked about some of the fundamental precursors to the American Revolution that breaks out into the open in July of 1776. Quick backstory before we plunge into those 3 points I have up on the slide there. The key one I want to make here is, remember how I said that in terms of mercantilism, the groups most motivated to get rid of mercantilism were the economic elite. Right, the New England merchants and the southern plantation owners. So they had economic reasons for revolution. What about, right, the ordinary Americans, the laborers, the small farmers, the artisans, the shopkeepers? What about them? They were, I think, a little bit differently motivated, because mercantilism didn't really have a direct economic effect on them. So I think they were more motivated by that, right? The idea of self-governance, that we don't want to be ruled from afar by a monarchy. We want to rule ourselves in a relatively democratic way. So I think you had sort of split motives here among Americans. The economic elite had strong economic incentives for revolution. The ordinary American had political motives, the desire for self-governance. Captured, right, by that phrase, no taxation without representation. That captures, right, the combination of both economic motives for revolution and political motives for revolution. So we have this, right, this I would call it an unvirtuous cycle of Britain imposing taxes and various controls over the American colonies, the colonies reacting negatively to that, right, with increasing protests against those policies. And then that makes the Brits even angrier. Well, it's kind of like the parent-child relationship, right? As the child approaches young adulthood, right? The child misbehaves in the eyes of the parent. They ground the child. That makes the child angry and resentful, and so they push further, and that makes the parents even angrier, and it makes the kids even more resentful, right? Until it blows up. Same thing here, right? This unvirtuous cycle of Britain imposing policies that make the colonists resentful. That angers the Brits even more, so they push even harsher policies. And then the colonists get even angrier, and it just sort of builds until it blows up in this unvirtuous cycle. The road to revolution is upon us. So you do have these growing tensions, right? And then it sort of culminates in the year 1775 in the battles of Lexington and Concord. Right. So now you're getting conflict breaking out into the open in terms of actual physical violence between the two groups. So, you know, with that, really, revolution is upon us, and the hastily pulled together Continental Congress passes a Declaration of Independence in the year 1776, 4th of July. Boom. It is now open revolution against the mother country. And I might note that this presages colonial uprisings across the globe, right? So the age of colonialism, this is sort of the early death knell of that era in world history. The Americans are some of the first to question and then go after that colonial relationship. And honestly, you would say, right, for the European superpowers, this was too good to last. This was too good to last. And it starts to fall apart in the year 1776. And subsequent to that, additional colonial uprisings across the globe. Although you would say, really, right, that the age of colonialism doesn't really come to an end until after World War II. So this is early days of the beginning of the end for colonialism. Although our book doesn't go into this at all, I like to include it. That's kind of cool stuff to know about the American Revolution in terms of the military conflict. So I got 6 points there. I want to cover them quickly. Number one, recognize that at the time of the Revolution, Great Britain was arguably the world's most powerful nation. We had the world's most powerful navy because they were an island nation, so they had a great navy. That was going to be tough for us, right? Because we were 13 colonies strung up and down the eastern edge of North America, right, with the Atlantic Ocean and the Delaware River cutting in, the Hudson River cutting in, the Potomac cutting in, Chesapeake Bay, like a lot of water. and Britain was going to dominate that water and move their troops and material quickly up and down the coast and inland on these major rivers, navigable rivers. Huge problems for the Americans going into this. But on the flip side, right, Britain had to get their troops and their war material and their information all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and back again, over and over again. That Atlantic crossing was no easy thing. It was dangerous and it took a long time. I think the fastest you could traverse it back then with sailing ships was like maybe 3 weeks, and it could be more like 6 depending on the weather and the wind. So that was tough for them, right? Long supply lines and information lines. We didn't have that problem, right? We had home field advantage. Home field advantage. That was a big deal. That's point number 3. We also knew the terrain better than the Brits did. Yeah, and remember the Brits, some of their military were, what do you call them? Mercenaries, right? The Hessians out of what is now Germany. Right? So if you're a paid mercenary, are you going to fight quite as hard versus, you're the home field and you're trying to protect? It's like right now the Russians, right, against Ukraine. Why is Ukraine overperforming Russia? Home field advantage, devotion to country, defense of the country. Who are the Russians using mostly to fight this war? The Wagner Group, right, the mercenaries. The more things change, the more they stay the same. We also had George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. That's where the action was. Now look, intellectually, George Washington was no genius. He never claimed to be a genius. He wasn't. But he was inspirational and tenacious. And he could learn from his mistakes. And he made a lot of mistakes at the beginning of the war. But he learned. What do they say? Right, when you get knocked down, that's not a big deal. The big deal is when you get back up again. All right. So if you can keep getting back up off that canvas to fight another day, that's going to serve you well. So we had old George Washington. If there's anybody who's ever been indispensable in American history, it was George Washington. Hard to imagine we could have won that Revolutionary War without George Washington at the head of the Continental Army. Another point number 5. Look, we had our A-team over in Europe at this time, negotiating deals with European institutions and actors. We had Thomas Jefferson over there. We had John Adams over there. We had Benjamin Franklin over there. Talk about an A-team. What were they doing, among other things? Negotiating with the French to get them to provide us with a navy to make a more equal playing field with the British Navy. So that was largely the work of Franklin and Jefferson. So we got a French Navy, right? Now, did the French do that just because it was the right thing to do? Heck no. Right? The French did it because their historic rivals were the British. And this is a way to stick a big French thumb in the eye of the Brits. Without the French Navy, I don't see how we could have won that war. And John Adams, in particular, was able to convince Dutch bankers, where that was the center of the banking world back then, was in, what is that, the Netherlands? I always get that confused. Who are the Dutch? Are they in the Netherlands? I think so. But we'll just say the Dutch bankers provided us with loans to finance the war. War is expensive then and now. And, that was critical then for Washington to show that we could maybe win militarily, right? Because the Dutch bankers were not going to give us those loans unless they thought we had a chance of winning, right? Because if they loaned us the money and we lost, they would have not have gotten their money back. So there was kind of this complex interplay between what was happening on the battlefield and what was happening in terms of diplomacy over in Western Europe. So Washington was able to win enough of those battles to convince the Dutch bankers to loan us the money. And then finally, the rules of the game favored America. Turns out the rule of the game here was that the British Army had to completely annihilate Washington's Continental Army to win. As long as there was even a remnant of the Continental Army, they could live to fight another day. That was the tough thing for the Brits. They had to utterly annihilate the Continental Army and put it out of its misery. What did Washington have to do? Win from time to time in terms of battles, but mostly stay alive, right? So a lot of it was, you ambush the Brits, you punch the crap out of them, and then you run like hell to live to fight another day. We did not want to go toe-to-toe with them on open battlefields for the most part. So, Washington understood the assignment, right? Win some battles for sure, but mostly survive to fight another day. And that's what he was able to do, right? Because Britain, year after they thought they were going to win quickly, just like Russia thought they were going to win quickly in Ukraine. And what's Ukraine's job? Not to defeat Russia per se, but to make it clear to Russia that they're never going to win and just give up because it's not worth it. Same thing here, right? Our job was to convince the Brits it wasn't worth it. And that's what Washington did brilliantly. He convinced them that they were never going to defeat him completely, and he would win from time to time, and was winning increasingly towards the end. And that convinced the Brits ultimately to give it up, right? They had other concerns, and this was an expensive war for them. They had a lot going on over in Europe in terms of their historic rivals, the French, the rise of Spain as a competitor. They had lots of other things on their menu to deal with. So ultimately, we get that successful revolution, and these are some of the reasons why. Because on paper, you would have said the Brits are going to win that war.